Hey everybody, it's David Jenkins with Fonville Morrissey Realty. I want to talk for a minute about what closing costs a seller and a buyer might be expected to pay in the process of selling or buying a house in North Carolina. So for the seller, the number one cost is usually the real estate commissions. Now there's not a law that says the seller has to pay the commissions, but it customarily works out this way, that a seller will meet with the real estate agent, they'll work out a listing agreement, and in that listing agreement the seller agrees to pay a certain commission, and then in the listing agreement is specified what part of that commission would be paid to the firm representing the seller and what part of that commission might be paid to a firm who might be representing a buyer. That's all spelled out in the listing agreement. And then in North Carolina, in the Triangle area, on the MLS page, there's a little section that shows the buyer's agent how much commission the buyer's agent's firm might be receiving in the sale of this property should the buyer's agent bring a buyer and it come to fruition and have a closing. But it doesn't have to be that way. So for instance, it could be that I'm working with a buyer and they want to buy a property that's for sale by owner and it's not advertised anywhere how much that commission would be. Well, so the first thing I need to do is talk to the seller of that property and see if they'd be willing to pay my commission. Because if they're not willing to pay my commission, I'm not paid a salary. Our firm needs to be paid. We love our clients, but we do need to be paid. So then I would have to have a conversation with my buyers to say, if you want me to represent you in this transaction, then you'd have to pay my commission. That's a very rare situation, but it does sometimes happen. So the conversation needs to be had. But anyway, in 99% of the time, the seller is paying the real estate commissions, both on the side that's representing the seller, the listing agent, and on the side that's representing the buyer, the buyer's agent or the selling agent. Other fees, closing costs that a seller might be expected to pay in a typical real estate transaction would be an excise tax. Now, not every state has an excise tax, and the amount of that tax varies from state to state. But currently in North Carolina, for the sale of real property, there's an excise tax that the seller pays, and it's $2 per $1,000 of sales price. So for instance, on a $100,000 sale, it would be expected that a seller would pay $200 of excise tax. Or on a $200,000 sale, $400 of excise tax, and so on. Property tax. In addition to the excise tax, of course, sellers always paying property tax, and that bill typically in North Carolina comes out in late summer and is due at the very end of the year. So if there's a sale in the beginning of the year, no one knows exactly what the property tax would be for that year, because there every so often, say 7 years or sometimes less than that, there's an assessment, and then the rates change, the property tax rate changes every year. So it's an estimate using last year's property tax that's prorated, or if the sale happens toward the end of the year, then we know how much the tax bill is and down to the penny. It's not just an estimate, but the settlement agent, the closing attorney, would then divide up the property tax bill between buyer and seller. So the seller is going to be paying for prorated property tax. And if there's a homeowner association, that bill is also prorated. If the seller has paid HOA dues in advance, then in that case the seller would get a credit, not a debit, for HOA dues that the seller had paid for but not been able to enjoy the HOA during that time. The seller also pays for the preparation of the deed and lien waiver, normally put together by an attorney, usually by the attorney who's doing the closing, who's chosen by the buyer. But the seller could select their own attorney to prepare the deed and lien waiver should the seller decide to do so. Typical costs for preparing the deed and lien waiver might be anywhere between $150 and $225, depending on the attorney. For the buyer, closing costs would typically consist of a loan origination fee if the buyer is getting a loan, which happens in about 90% of real estate transactions in the Triangle today. The amount of that fee depends on working out a relationship with the lender, because a buyer might call a lender and say, well, what is your rate? And the lender might say, well, what do you want the rate to be? And you might think that's a crazy question, but it could be a buyer wants to have very low fees, they're willing to have a higher interest rate, or it could be that the buyer would be willing to have it the other way around. So this loan origination fee is negotiable with the lender. If there's a loan, the lender is going to want to order an appraisal, and the amount of that appraisal might be $500, give or take $100, that the buyer would pay. A survey is completely optional, but always a good idea to know where the property lines are. Inspection fees usually are paid at the time of the inspection, but it could be that the bill is just sent to the settlement agent, to the closing attorney, and that amount is debited from the buyer's side, and those inspection fees are paid at the closing and are part of the closing costs in the contract known as the expenses, the buyer's expenses. Closing costs, those are synonymous. And the attorney fees, and those vary depending on the attorney, anywhere between $750 and $1,200, depending on the attorney, to do all the title search and so on before the closing, and to sit down with the buyer and go through the loan documents, and then afterwards record the deed. Title insurance, to make sure there's no problem with the title, is a fee that's paid for by the buyer, and usually the title insurance covers both the buyer's equity in the purchase as well as the buyer's lender's portion of the purchase price. Hazard insurance or homeowner's insurance is paid for a year in advance at the closing. That's part of the buyer's closing cost. And then funding an escrow account, if there is one, so that a year from now there'll be plenty of money in that escrow account to pay for another year of homeowner's insurance and to pay for property taxes when they're due. So those are all the different closing costs. If you have a negotiation between buyer and seller during the due diligence period, and the buyer says, seller, I'm willing to move forward with this transaction if, if instead of making repairs, you'll agree to pay X number of dollars of my closing costs or expenses, then the seller might agree to that, the buyer might agree to that, but you need to make sure, if there's an agreement about seller paid expenses during the due diligence agreement period, that those expenses that are agreed upon are not more than the actual closing costs are. So for instance, you couldn't say if the closing costs amounted, these things for a buyer amounted to say $6,000, and then the negotiations between buyer and seller during a due diligence period, the seller would say, okay, well, I'll pay $10,000 of your expenses. That's not going to work. The lender's not going to go for that. The expenses paid by a seller for a buyer cannot exceed what these amounts add up to. Okay? So you wouldn't want to have an agreement for $10,000 worth of expenses when the expenses only added to $6,000, or a buyer would be leaving money on the table. I hope that makes sense. If I can answer any questions about this or anything else related to residential real estate, please let me know. I'd be happy to help. Thank you.